Catherine, you're the costume designer on AMC's new show, The Sun, which is just now wrapping up its first season. People are still discovering this show, so why don't you tell us a little bit about the show and some of the challenges that it presented to you from a design standpoint?
The show is a wonderful piece that's set between two time periods. It's based on a book by Philipp Meyer, and Philipp's book takes you on this extraordinary journey from 1849 all the way through the 1970s. For the first 10 episodes of this season, they chose just to focus between 1849 with the protagonist Eli as a teenager, and then him as a grandfather in 1915, trying to keep his family together. So you jump between the two time periods in each episode, which is amazing. It has its own design challenges, obviously. We're in a part of history all over Europe and America, but most especially in America, where things changed dramatically between 1849 and 1915. And the piece of the world we're dealing in, which is Texas, has its own idiosyncrasies because America is so enormous and covers so many different climates and ways of life. I really had to focus, or I chose to focus specifically on Texas. The good news with the 1915 is that there is wonderful photographic material out there, and I was able to find amateur photographers who took photographs of that part of the world. So it wasn't just portraiture. Often in these earlier time periods, you had traveling photographers who went from village to village, and they dressed people up and they had formal portraits taken, very often not even in their own clothing. It's hot, it's dirty, there's large distances, but there was also a lot of money in Texas by 1915, and people were traveling to Europe, they were traveling to New York. So you get a wide range of looks and feels in the clothes and in the people according to their social status. That was probably a very long sentence.
No, it was wonderful. So then, I mean, for the 1849 stuff, what kind of research were you able to draw upon?
Oh, wow, gosh. Well, 1849 has its, for the European piece of 1849, you can go back to sketches and drawings and accounts and paintings. The Comanche, which is most of our 1849, is a whole other ball of wax because they were sort of on the run. They were nomadic. They were desperately feared by everybody else because they were such extraordinary warriors. So that piece was a bit like being a detective. It was amazing. I worked in conjunction with Juanita Padapone, who is a member of the Comanche people and the Comanche tribe. And the Comanche people were incredibly gracious to me. They opened their hearts, they opened their research. I got into archives up in Oklahoma that most people don't see. I had the privilege of talking to some of the elders and listening to their stories. They are a unique people, and there are aspects to their clothing that you don't find in the other tribes. Because they were nomadic, they weren't doing any beadwork yet. They traveled very light. And so everything was very practical. And there's idiosyncrasies to their clothing that, as I said, you don't find in any other tribe. So I went into archives, and then we pieced together history. Juanita helped me, and some of her friends and associates who are historians helped me. We could find sketches and watercolors that were done by an artist by the name of George Catlin from the 1830s. And then you don't really find any real artifacts until about 1875, almost the early 1880s. And those pieces I was able to see up in Oklahoma. So we bridged the gap between those, I bridged the gap between those early drawings and the artifacts that I saw up in Oklahoma. I sketched it. I sent that up to Oklahoma to Juanita, and then made sure that it was approved and made sense to her people.
In terms of expressing the show's...
And then we had to make it all. Detail. I forgot that piece. About 100 people. Moccasins, jerkins, leggings, dresses, you name it, children, everything in between. We had to make it. I forgot that small piece.
Well, okay. I mean, well, I was going to ask you about that anyway. I guess the practicality of doing something that's ambitious on a TV schedule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not for the faint-hearted. But I did my thesis at art school in England on the mystery cycle of the Hopi Indian.
Oh,
and
wow.
I've always, I mean, it's sort of been a running joke. If you ask any of my crew or my associates, they will tell you that as long as I've lived in California, I've always said I always wanted to do this time period, or anything around these two time periods. And everybody just laughed and said, yeah, you're English. You know, they're going to give you nice little tidy Jane Austen pieces if you're lucky. And then this came along, and I just went in with every book and every piece of research on my knees and said, please, let me do this. And I think the advantage I have in an odd way is that I didn't grow up in America. And so I don't have any preconceived notions of what the Wild West or any time period through the 19th century into the earliest 20th century should look like in Texas. And I think that gave me a very clean palette to start with. It meant that the research and the photographs and the artifacts and the history that I found for me it wasn't colored or prejudiced by anything that I had seen in childhood. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, it does. Actually, I was having a conversation with somebody, excuse me, about the same kind of thing, who was working on a show that was about a big piece of British history, and he said because he wasn't British, he had a different kind of insight into it. So
yeah, same thing.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of expressing the thematic material of the story through color and texture and things like that, how did you? What were your thoughts there?
I tried to use dyes and colors that really were true to the period. That said, in Europe, they were already doing some of these very bright primary colors, and there was some remarkable colors that were starting to come into textiles. That said, if you're working in cotton and linen and wool and you're washing those articles of clothing regularly, and then they're hanging in the sun to dry, because you don't have a washer and a dryer in your garage, it does tend to bleach the colors out quite a bit. But I didn't want it to look sort of the classic sepia toned, rub my eyes, where did the color go? So we tried to find a balance, and I worked in direct relationship with Carrie, my production designer, and also George Steele, our extraordinary cinematographer. At a certain point, it sort of becomes organic. I think if you look at enough of the material and you look at the colors and the textures of Texas and the area, the hill country around Austin, which is remarkable, it just sort of makes sense. Mm-hmm. That's not a very good answer, is it? But I mean, I think you find a world where it does make sense. My whole vision, my whole determination, my mandate to my crew and myself every single day was, I want us to be able to walk onto the set. I want us to be able to walk into any environment and believe that we really have walked back in history, that it's real. They don't look like costumes, they look like clothes. And every time we had extras on the set, I spent 5-10 minutes saying, behave like real people. This is not some costume drama. These are real people in real time, and you're telling the story and the history, in many cases, of your ancestors. And some of the extras were great. They would bring in early photographs of their ancestors. There was one gentleman whose grandfather had worked on the railroads. And I said to him, please bring the photograph in for us. So he did. And we dressed him exactly like his grandfather. Wow. And so the pride and the dignity and the grace with which he carried that extra I said, because, you know, you guys are just as important, and you see it time and time again. You see the principal characters and your leading actors looking amazing. And then the background is just stuff. It's moving furniture. And we were all very committed to that not being the case.
Well, it certainly shows. I also wanted to ask you, you're welcome. I also wanted to ask you about charting the arc of these characters through your designs. I mean, you cover a lot of ground, 66 years in this show. So, I mean, it's a heck of an arc for a character to have to portray.
Well, young Eli is the first time you see him, all of that reference material was very influenced by sorry, my brain's going. Once he becomes Comanche, let me change gears. Once he becomes Comanche or takes on the Comanche lifestyle, one of the things we did do was the first time he comes to the village, we kept the palette and the actual clothing. I wouldn't say we made it flat, but I made a deliberate and conscious effort that as young Eli gets to know the Comanche world better and his eyes are opened to the Comanche way of life, the detail in the Comanche clothing and the painting in the Comanche clothing and some of the jewelry became more intricate. And that was a deliberate choice that we made. The production, I think all of us felt that part of what made it interesting was the fact that when he first came, he had the sort of Western European preconceived notion that these were savages. And then as the series goes on, he realizes the depth, the warmth, the subtlety, and the loyalty that these people, this extraordinary group of people have, and that maybe they have some of the stuff right and the settlers don't.
Right, yeah. You've worked on a wide variety of films and television shows, contemporary, period, fantasy. I wonder what attracts you to the projects that you decide to take on?
The writing. That's a very easy answer for me, the writing. It all starts with the story. You can be asked to design the most amazing something, but if your audience isn't drawn in and if the actors and the writing isn't there, then you're just spinning your wheels. My job is to tell the story through the clothes, and if I've given a good story to tell, it makes my life much easier. It also makes my life much more interesting. I mean, I'm sort of an archaeologist, really, or an archaeologist / anthropologist. What interests me is not them looking pretty or them looking tragic. What interests me is you as the audience member going in and believing that they are who they say they are. Mm-hmm. So how long have they had their shoes? Do they fit them? Have they been handed down to them? How often do they shower and change? How fastidious are they? Are they vain? Do they love certain colors? Do they deliberately? Maria makes a conscious choice when she comes back home to not make a huge effort initially to fit in. That's part of her personality. That's not me saying, ooh, let me do some fabulous costume, although I am pleased with them. It's me saying, how do I help tell her story? How do I help the audience understand that, yes, indeed, she did live in New York for a number of years, and she is bucking tradition within her community to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm. And for your work on Desperate Housewives, you received 4 Emmy nominations. I wonder what that recognition meant to you.
It's enormous. The years that I was nominated, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I was fortunate enough to be nominated, and all of the other shows were period or fantasy. And at that time, the Television Academy only had 1 category for costumes. It's an enormous honor to be acknowledged by your peers. And my hope is that one day the Television Academy will separate out fantasy and science fiction from period. There is so much from contemporary. We have managed to split contemporary from fantasy and period. There's so much extraordinary work being done between television and streaming. It's astounding, the quality of the work that I'm privileged to see from my associates and my contemporaries is ridiculous. And it's coming from all over. So yes, it's special. The first time I was nominated, my parents were still alive, and I got to take them to the event and to the ball afterwards. And you know, I'm an artist. My parents used to chew their nails wondering that I would ever support myself. So that was an enormous gift. That was an enormous gift to be able to take them and say, you know, my peers have honored me, and we're going to go to a crazy party and have a good time. And thank you for all the times you told me to keep going. And it's a story when I'm privileged enough to go in and talk to students at university. It's a story I tell because I think it's important. There's many, many times when you don't get the job and you think it's the end of the world, or you really hope that you're going to get the next job. And sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's not, and often it's not.
Mm-hmm. Well, Catherine, thank you so much, and congratulations on the son. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good